It all started with the creak of the old back door. It was late, well past midnight, and the farmhouse was shrouded in an eerie silence. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind restless. Then I heard it, a sound so faint I almost thought I imagined it. But when I sat up and strained to listen, it came again, the soft, deliberate squeak of the screen door easing shut. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Who was sneaking out of the house at this hour? Sliding out of bed, I moved to the window, careful not to make a sound. Peering through the curtains, I saw a figure moving across the moonlit yard. My stepsister, Claire. Her long hair glinted silver in the moonlight as she crept toward the barn, a lantern swinging in her hand. What the hell was she doing out there? Claire and I had never been close. We weren't exactly enemies, but we weren't friends either. She was older, more serious, always wrapped up in her own world. We'd only been living under the same roof for a few months since my dad married her mom, and I still didn't feel like I truly knew her. But there was something about her that always seemed different. She was quiet but intense, her green eyes often lingering on things longer than they should. Lately, I'd noticed she'd been acting strange, distracted, slipping away at odd times. And now, in the middle of the night, she was heading to the barn like she was keeping some kind of secret. My curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing a hoodie, I slipped on my boots and crept out of my room. The farmhouse was still and dark, the old floorboards creaking softly under my weight as I made my way to the door. By the time I stepped outside, the cold night air hitting my face, Claire had already disappeared into the barn. The barn loomed ahead, its weathered wooden walls dark against the pale light of the moon. The door was ajar, just enough for me to see the faint glow of her lantern inside. I approached slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. When I got closer, I heard it, a low, rhythmic sound that sent a shiver down my spine. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the hay or the old beams creaking under the weight of time. But then I heard Claire's voice. It was soft, barely audible, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, like she was talking to someone. Or something. I pressed myself against the side of the barn, trying to steady my breathing. Peeking through the crack in the door, I saw her standing in the middle of the barn, the lantern casting flickering shadows across the walls. She was leaning against one of the stalls, her body half hidden by the wood. I could see the outline of something large moving behind her. My stomach churned. I couldn't see clearly, but I could hear the sounds, the faint shuffling of hay, the soft creak of wood, and Claire's low, hushed murmurs. Her voice was calm, almost soothing, as if she was comforting someone. Or maybe herself. I wanted to call out to her, to demand an explanation, but I couldn't move. Something about the scene was wrong. My gut told me that if I stepped into the barn, I'd see something I wasn't supposed to. But I couldn't just walk away. Summoning my courage, I pushed the door open a little wider. The hinges groaned softly, and Claire froze, her head snapping around. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us moved. "Jake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing out here?" I asked, stepping inside. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Claire's gaze darted to the shadows behind her, and she moved to block my view. "Nothing," she said quickly. "Go back to bed." "Nothing," I repeated, my eyes narrowing. "You're sneaking out to the barn in the middle of the night, talking to—" I gestured vaguely toward the shadows. "What is going on, Claire?" "It's none of your business," she snapped, her voice sharp now. "Just go." Her reaction only fueled my suspicion. I took another step forward, the lantern light illuminating her face. She looked nervous. Her cheeks were flushed, and her breathing was shallow, like she'd been caught in the act of something she wasn't supposed to be doing. "Is this about the horse?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Claire stiffened, her eyes flashing. "Just leave, Jake." "No," I said, crossing my arms. "Not until you tell me what's going on." Claire stared at me, her chest rising and falling as if she'd just run a mile. The lantern light flickered between us, casting strange shadows across her face. For a moment, I thought she was going to lash out, to scream at me to leave. But instead, she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "You wouldn't understand," she said, her voice quiet but tinged with frustration. "Try me," I replied, stepping closer. "Because right now, it looks like you're sneaking out here to what?" "Whisper to the horses in the dark." Her eyes darted to the corner of the barn where the shadows seemed darker, heavier. She bit her lip, hesitating. "It's not like that," she said finally. "It's just complicated. Complicated." The word hung in the air like a challenge. If she thought that would make me back off, she was dead wrong. "What's complicated about a barn?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "You've been sneaking out here for weeks, Claire. Do you think I haven't noticed? What are you hiding?" "Jake, just drop it," she said, her tone sharp now. "It's none of your business." Her defiance only made me angrier. I took another step forward, my gaze flicking past her to the stall behind her. Something moved in the shadows, a faint rustle of hay that sent a shiver down my spine. My stomach churned. "What's in there?" I demanded, my voice steadier than I felt. "Nothing," she snapped, moving to block my view. "It's just the horse." But her words didn't match the panic in her eyes. My heart was pounding now, my curiosity burning through the fog of fear that had settled over me. "Move," I said, my voice firm. "No," she shot back, planting herself firmly in front of the stall. "You don't need to see." Her reaction only made me more determined. I stepped around her, ignoring her protests as I peered into the shadows. The stall was dimly lit, the lantern's glow barely reaching the back wall. At first, I couldn't make out anything unusual. Just the familiar sight of hay scattered on the floor, the faint smell of wood and earth. But then I saw it, a figure, large, looming, and disturbingly still. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shape was unmistakable. It was the horse, his dark coat blending into the shadows. But there was something about the way he stood there, watching me, that made my skin crawl. "See?" Claire said behind me, her voice trembling slightly. "It's just him. Nothing else." But her words didn't ease the knot in my chest. The horse shifted slightly, his hooves scraping against the floor, and I thought I heard a low, guttural sound. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing or hearing. "You're lying," I said finally, turning back to her. "There's more to this, Claire. I can feel it." Her eyes flashed, a mixture of anger and something else, something I couldn't quite name. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice tight. "Just go back to bed, Jake. Please." The plea in her voice stopped me for a moment. But then I thought about all the nights I'd heard her sneaking out, all the times I caught her slipping away with that lantern in hand. This wasn't just about a horse. It couldn't be. "No," I said, shaking my head. "Not this time. You're hiding something, and I'm not leaving until you tell me what it is." Claire let out a frustrated sigh, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "You wouldn't get it," she said again, her voice rising. "You just think it's wrong." "Wrong?" The word made my pulse quicken. "What's wrong, Claire? What the hell is going on here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, her hand brushing against the edge of the stall. The horse shifted again, his massive frame casting a long shadow on the wall. For a moment, I thought she was going to ignore me, to leave me standing there in the barn with more questions than answers. But then she looked back at me, her green eyes shining in the dim light. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You want to know? Stay. Watch. But don't say I didn't warn you." Her words sent a chill through me, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I watched as she stepped closer to the stall, her movements slow and deliberate. The horse didn't flinch, didn't even blink, as she reached out to touch him. "Claire," I started, but my voice trailed off as I realized I had no idea what I was going to say. She ignored me, her focus entirely on the massive figure in front of her. The barn seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I took a step back, my heart racing. I didn't know what I was about to witness, but every instinct in my body told me I wasn't ready for it. The air in the barn felt heavier with each passing second. My hands trembled as I stood frozen in place, watching Claire as she moved closer to the stall. The lantern's dim glow flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with her every step. The horse's massive frame loomed in the dim light, his dark coat blending into the shadows. Claire's hand reached out, brushing against his side in a way that seemed almost intimate. My stomach churned. "Claire," I said, my voice cracking. "This is crazy. What are you doing?" She didn't answer, her focus entirely on the horse. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like she was trying not to startle him or herself. The barn was silent except for the faint rustle of hay and the soft sound of her breath. I wanted to grab her, to pull her away from whatever this was, but I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my mind spinning with questions I didn't want to ask. "You don't understand," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then explain it to me," I replied, my voice firmer now. "Because from where I'm standing, this doesn't make any sense." She turned to look at me, her green eyes shimmering with something I couldn't name, something between defiance and desperation. "You think this is easy for me," she said, her voice rising. "You think I wanted this?" Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Wanted what, Claire? What the hell are you talking about?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned back to the horse, her hand trailing along his side. He shifted slightly, the sound of his hooves against the wooden floor echoing in the quiet barn. For a moment, I thought she was going to ignore me again, to leave me standing there in the dark with more questions than answers. But then she spoke. "It's not like I planned this," she said softly, her voice trembling. "It just happened." "What happened?" I demanded, my frustration boiling over. "Claire, stop speaking in riddles and just tell me." She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and something else, something that looked a lot like guilt. "You wouldn't get it," she said, shaking her head. "You're too busy judging me to even try." "Judging you?" I repeated, my voice incredulous. "Claire, I don't even know what I'm supposed to be judging. You're sneaking out here every night, talking to a horse like he's. I stopped, the words catching in my throat. Her eyes flashed, and she stepped closer to me. "Like he's what?" she challenged, her voice sharp. "Say it, Jake." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "Like he's more than just a horse," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The barn fell silent again, the weight of my words hanging in the air. Claire didn't respond, her gaze dropping to the floor. For a moment, I thought she was going to deny it, to brush me off like she always did. But then she let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping. "You don't know what it's like," she said quietly, her voice so soft I almost didn't hear her. "To feel so disconnected. To feel like no one understands you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know what to say, what to think. The Claire I thought I knew was unraveling in front of me, and I didn't know how to stop it. "Claire," I said softly, stepping closer. "Whatever this is, you don't have to go through it alone. Just talk to me." She looked up at me then, her green eyes shining with unshed tears. "You don't get it, Jake," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't something you can fix." The horse shifted again, his massive frame casting a long shadow on the barn wall. Claire's gaze flicked to him, and for a moment, I thought I saw something pass between them, something I couldn't explain. "You should go," she said finally, her voice firm. "This isn't your problem." "No," I said, shaking my head. "Not this time. You've been sneaking out here for weeks, Claire. I'm not leaving until you tell me the truth." Her jaw tightened, and she took a step back, putting more distance between us. "Fine," she said, her voice cold now. "Stay. Watch. But don't say I didn't warn you." Her words sent a chill through me, but I didn't move. I couldn't. My curiosity had turned into something darker, something heavier. I needed to know. I watched as she turned back to the horse, her hand brushing against his side in a way that made my stomach churn. The barn seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I stood there, my body rigid, watching as Claire's hand lingered on the horse's flank. Her movements were deliberate, her touch almost tender. The low light of the lantern flickered, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to shift and dance in time with my racing thoughts. "Claire," I said, my voice cracking as I stepped forward. "This isn't normal. Whatever's happening here, it's not right." She didn't look at me, her focus entirely on the massive animal beside her. Her fingers trailed along his coat, her lips moving as if she were whispering something I couldn't hear. The horse shifted slightly, his hooves scraping against the floor, and let out a low, rumbling sound that made my stomach twist. "Why can't you just leave it alone?" she asked finally, her voice soft but laced with frustration. "Why do you have to ruin everything?" "Ruin what?" I demanded, my voice louder now. "Claire, you're sneaking out here in the middle of the night, acting like..." I stopped, unable to put the thought into words. "I don't even know what. But this isn't normal." Her shoulders tensed, and for a moment, I thought she was going to lash out. Instead, she let out a shaky breath, her hand still resting against the horse's side. "I don't expect you to understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've never understood me." Her words stung, but I refused to let her deflect. "Then help me understand," I shot back. "Because right now, it looks like you're hiding something that doesn't make sense." Claire turned to face me, her green eyes flashing with anger, and something else, something I couldn't quite name. "You want the truth?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Fine, but you're not going to like it." Before I could respond, she stepped away from the horse, her hand falling to her side. The lantern's light flickered again, casting strange patterns across her face as she stared at me. "You think I'm crazy, don't you?" she said, her voice rising. "You think there's something wrong with me?" "I don't know what to think," I admitted, my voice quieter now. "But I know you're not being honest with me." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she crossed her arms over her chest. "Maybe I don't owe you honesty," she said sharply. "Maybe this is something you're better off not knowing." Her words sent a chill through me, but I refused to back down. "You don't get to decide that," I said, stepping closer. "I'm your brother, your family. Whatever's going on here, I have a right to know." "Family?" she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "We've known each other for less than a year, Jake. Don't pretend you care." Her accusation hit harder than I expected, but I didn't let it show. "That doesn't matter," I said firmly. "What matters is that something's not right here, Claire. And I'm not leaving until I figure out what it is." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You're so stubborn," she muttered. "Fine. Stay. Watch. See for yourself." Her words sent a fresh wave of unease through me, but I stood my ground. I wasn't about to let her scare me off. Claire turned back to the horse, her movements slow and deliberate. The barn was deathly quiet now, the only sound the faint rustle of hay beneath her feet. She placed both hands on his side, her fingers splayed against his dark coat, and leaned in close. "Claire," I said again, my voice trembling slightly. "Stop this. Please." But she ignored me. The horse shifted again, his massive frame casting a long shadow that seemed to engulf us both. I could hear the soft sound of her breathing, steady but shallow, as she pressed her forehead against his side. For a moment, I thought I saw her lips move, but the words, if there were any, were too soft to hear. The horse let out a low, rumbling sound, almost like a growl, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Enough," I said, my voice firmer now. "Claire, step away from him." She didn't move. Her body was tense, her focus entirely on the animal in front of her. I clenched my fists, my frustration boiling over as I took another step forward. "Claire!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the barn. She finally turned to face me, her eyes wide and filled with something I couldn't name. For a moment, she looked like she was about to say something important. But then she shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You'll never understand," she said softly. Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. My chest tightened, my mind racing with questions I couldn't bring myself to ask. The barn seemed darker now, the shadows closing in around us as the lantern's light dimmed. "I don't get it," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why, Claire? Why are you doing this?" She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned back to the horse, her hands brushing against his side one last time. "Because it's the only thing that makes sense," she said quietly. "Even if you don't see it." The silence in the barn was suffocating. Claire's words echoed in my head. "Because it's the only thing that makes sense." I stood frozen, my mind racing, trying to piece together the fragments of this bizarre and unsettling puzzle. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. What exactly makes sense about sneaking out here in the middle of the night? About this? I gestured vaguely toward the horse, my hands trembling. Claire didn't answer immediately. She ran her hand along the horse's side again, her movements slow and deliberate. The animal shifted slightly, his dark eyes watching me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. You wouldn't get it, she said finally, her voice soft but firm. You're too focused on what's normal. But life isn't always about what's normal, Jake. Her words sent a shiver through me. What does that even mean? I demanded, stepping closer. Claire, you're talking in riddles. Just tell me the truth. She turned to face me, her green eyes blazing with a mix of frustration and something that looked like desperation. You really want to know? She asked, her voice rising. Fine, but don't blame me when you can't handle it. Before I could respond, she moved back to the stall, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden frame. The horse let out a low, rumbling sound, almost like a growl, and my heart skipped a beat. Claire turned her head slightly, just enough to glance at me over her shoulder. You don't have to stay, she said quietly. You can still walk away. Her words felt like a challenge, daring me to leave. But I couldn't. Something inside me refused to let this go, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn around and never look back. I'm not going anywhere, I said firmly. Whatever this is, I need to know. Claire let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Suit yourself, she muttered. But don't say I didn't warn you. The barn seemed to grow darker as she stepped closer to the horse, the lantern's light flickering weakly. I watched as she placed her hands on his side again, her fingers splayed against his dark coat. Her lips moved, and this time I could hear her voice, soft, almost like a chant. The horse shifted, his massive frame towering over her. He let out another low sound, a cross between a snort and a groan, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Claire, stop, I said, my voice trembling. This isn't right. She ignored me, her focus entirely on the animal. Her hands moved along his side, her touch slow and deliberate, and I noticed her breathing had changed, faster, shallower. The scene was surreal, like something out of a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her away. Enough! I shouted, my voice echoing through the barn. Tell me what's going on, or I'm dragging you out of here. Claire wrenched her arm free, her eyes blazing with anger. You don't get to control me, Jake, she snapped. You don't get to decide what's right or wrong for me. Her words hit me like a slap, but I held my ground. I'm not trying to control you, I said, my voice quieter now. I'm trying to protect you. Whatever this is, Claire, it's not healthy. It's not normal. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Normal, she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. You keep throwing that word around like it means something. But you don't know what it's like to feel like this. Like what? I asked, my chest tightening. Claire, talk to me. Please. She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she stepped back from the horse. For a moment, I thought she was going to open up, to finally tell me what had been haunting her. But then she shook her head, her expression hardening. You'll never understand, she said, her voice cold now. So stop trying. The weight of her words settled over me, and for the first time, I felt truly helpless. Claire turned back to the horse, her movements slower now, almost hesitant. The animal shifted again, his dark eyes watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I'm done here, I said finally, my voice hollow. If you want to keep destroying yourself, fine, but don't expect me to stand by and watch. Claire didn't respond. She didn't even look at me. Her focus was entirely on the horse, her hands brushing against his side, as if I wasn't even there. I turned and walked out of the barn, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, confusion, fear. I didn't know what I just witnessed, but one thing was clear. Something was deeply, deeply wrong. Back in the farmhouse, I paced the living room, my thoughts racing. I couldn't shake the image of Claire in the barn, her hands on the horse, her voice soft and pleading. What was she doing? What had driven her to this? And why couldn't I let it go? I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her voice, felt the weight of the mystery hanging over us. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep this to myself. The sun had barely risen when I made my way back to the barn. The cold morning air bit at my skin, but I barely felt it. My mind was clouded with questions, my heart pounding with determination. I couldn't let this go, not after what I'd seen last night. The barn door was ajar, the faint smell of hay and earth wafting out. I hesitated at the threshold, my stomach churning. Part of me didn't want to go inside, didn't want to face whatever truth lay waiting for me in the shadows. But I couldn't walk away. Not now. Inside, the barn was quiet, almost serene in the early morning light. The lantern was extinguished, its faint scent of oil lingering in the air. The horse stood in his stall, his massive frame shifting slightly as he turned to look at me. His dark eyes seemed to glimmer with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. But Claire was nowhere to be seen. "Claire?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty barn. No response. My heart sank as I took a few cautious steps forward, scanning the stalls for any sign of her. The barn felt different in the daylight, less ominous, but no less unsettling. The events of the night before played on a loop in my mind, each detail more disturbing than the last. I stopped in front of the horse's stall, my hands gripping the wooden frame. His dark eyes met mine, unblinking, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was something about the way he looked at me like he knew something I didn't, something I wasn't ready to face. "Jake!" Her voice startled me, and I whipped around to see Claire standing in the doorway. She looked exhausted, her hair disheveled and her eyes rimmed with red. She was clutching something in her hands, a notebook, its leather cover worn and frayed. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "I could ask you the same thing," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. "What the hell is going on, Claire?" "No more excuses. No more riddles. I want the truth." She sighed, her shoulders slumping as she stepped inside. "You don't understand," she said softly. "You can't? Then make me understand," I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "Because I'm done playing games." Claire hesitated, her fingers tightening around the notebook. She glanced at the horse, then back at me, her expression a mix of fear and defiance. "You really want to know?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Fine. But once you do, there's no going back." She opened the notebook, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. When she finally stopped, she held it out to me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I took it, my hands shaking as I looked down at the pages. The handwriting was Claire's, but the words were fragmented, disjointed, a mixture of ramblings, sketches, and what looked like journal entries. "He understands me. He sees me in a way no one else does. It's wrong, but it feels so right." My chest tightened as I read the words, each sentence more unsettling than the last. The sketches were crude, but unmistakable. Images of the horse, his massive frame looming over a smaller figure that I could only assume was Claire. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's the truth," she said simply. The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I flipped through the pages, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The entries grew darker, more erratic, until the last page was filled with nothing but a single sentence scrawled over and over again. "No one will understand." I looked up at her, my chest tightening with a mix of anger, fear, and confusion. "Claire, this isn't right. You need help." She shook her head, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I don't need help," she said firmly. "I need you to leave me alone." "Leave you alone?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Claire, whatever this is, it's not healthy. It's not normal." "Normal," she scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Who decides what's normal, Jake? You? Society? I don't care what's normal. I care about what feels real." Her words sent a chill through me, but I refused to back down. "This isn't real, Claire," I said, my voice trembling. "It's a fantasy, a delusion." She flinched at the word, her gaze dropping to the floor. For a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to her. But then she looked up, her expression hardening. "You'll never understand," she said quietly. "So stop trying." The barn fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. I didn't know what to say, what to do. Part of me wanted to shake her, to drag her out of the barn and force her to see reason. But another part of me, the part that had always felt like an outsider in her world, knew it wouldn't make a difference. "Fine," I said finally, my voice hollow. "If this is what you want, I'm done." Claire didn't respond. She didn't even look at me. Her focus was entirely on the horse, her hands brushing against his side, as if I wasn't even there. I turned and walked out of the barn, the cold morning air hitting me like a slap. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, fear. I didn't know what I'd just witnessed, but one thing was clear. Something was deeply, deeply wrong. Back at the farmhouse, I stared out the window, the barn a dark silhouette against the morning light. I wanted to believe this was over, that I could move on and forget what I'd seen. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. The image of Claire in that barn, her hands on the horse, her voice soft and pleading, it would haunt me forever.